The Battle of Stalingrad, fought between the 17th of July 1942 and the 2nd of February 1943, remains one of the most significant clashes in world history. It was not only the bloodiest battle of the Second World War, with estimates of 2 million military and civilian casualties, but it was also the turning point in the conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. What became part of Hitler's grand plan to dominate the Soviet Union ended in complete disaster for Germany, shattering its aura of invincibility and setting the Red Army on a march that would ultimately reach Berlin in 1945. By 1942, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, had failed to achieve its initial goals. Launched in June 1941, Barbarossa aimed for swift destruction of Soviet forces and the capture of Moscow. The Germans inflicted massive defeats on the Red Army, but by December 1941, Soviet counteroffensives had pushed the Wehrmacht back from Moscow. But the war in the east was far from over. Hitler now sought to regain the initiative in 1942. Instead of another push on Moscow, he turned southwards, targeting the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was vital for Germany's war machine, and securing it would both fuel the Wehrmacht and deprive the Soviets of their resources. The city of Stalingrad, sitting on the west bank of the river Volga, became a key objective. Its capture would protect the northern flank of the German advance into the Caucasus, cut Soviet transport links along the Volga, severing vital supply routes, and deal a symbolic blow by capturing the city that bore Joseph Stalin's name. For Hitler, this symbolism was crucial. He increasingly saw the war as a personal duel between himself and Joseph Stalin. Taking Stalingrad would be a propaganda triumph. The campaign to seize Stalingrad was part of Fall Blau, Case Blue, the German summer offensive launched in June 1942. The plan divided Army Group South into two main thrusts. Army Group A, tasked with advancing into the Caucasus to seize the oil fields, and Army Group B, including the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus, aimed at capturing Stalingrad and then guarding the northern flank. Initially, the offensive achieved great success. German and Allied Axis forces, including Romanians, Italians and Hungarians, advanced very rapidly across southern Russia. Soviet forces, still reeling from the losses of 1941, were pushed back. By late August, the Germans reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Yet the vast distances, stretched supply routes, and Soviet resistance soon slowed down the offensive. The Wehrmacht faced logistical difficulties, with fuel and ammunition shortages common. But despite these problems, Hitler insisted on pressing towards Stalingrad. Stalingrad, which today is known as Volgograd, was an industrial city of around 400,000 people before the war. It stretched some 30 miles along the west bank of the Volga and was only a few miles wide. This long, narrow shape, hemmed in by the river to the east and steppe to the west, made it difficult to defend and supply. Factories dominated the northern districts: the tractor factory, Zerzinsky factory, the Red October factory, and the Barikadi factory, producing tanks, artillery and weapons, were found. The southern part contained residential districts, while the central districts housed governmental buildings and grain elevators. The Volga was the city's lifeline, enabling supplies and reinforcements to cross from the east bank, even under constant German bombardment. On the 23rd of August 1942, the Luftwaffe launched a devastating air attack on Stalingrad. Waves and waves of German bombers reduced much of the city to rubble. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in this, though estimates do vary widely. Hitler and Paulus may have believed that the bombing would break Soviet morale and make the city easier to capture. Paradoxically, the ruins created by bombing turned the city into a fortress. Rubble, collapsed buildings and destroyed streets became defensive positions for Soviet troops, negating much of the German advantage in armour and mobility. By September, the German 6th Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army entered Stalingrad. They met fierce resistance from Soviet forces under the command of General Vasily Choykov, the commander of the 62nd Army. Choykov adopted a strategy of hugging the enemy, keeping his troops so close to the Germans that artillery and air support risked hitting their own men. This minimised the effectiveness of German firepower. The Germans advanced street by street, building by building. Famous locations became battlegrounds. The Mamiev Kurgan, a strategic hill overlooking the city, changed hands multiple times. The grain elevator, a huge silo, was defended for days by a small group of Soviet troops, and the factories in the north became epicentres of combat, with soldiers fighting inside machine halls and even by the assembly lines. Stalingrad became synonymous with brutal urban warfare. Soldiers described it as Rattenkrieg, a rat war. Fighting was often at point-blank range, in sewers, basements and stairwells. Snipers played a pivotal role, most famously Vasily Zaitsev, credited with hundreds of kills. Conditions for both sides were truly appalling though. Supplies were scarce, casualties enormous, and the freezing Russian winter worsened the suffering. Soviet soldiers crossed the Volga under constant German shelling, often with little more than rifles or even without weapons, expected to pick them up from fallen comrades. The Germans faced their own nightmare too. Each advance required storming fortified ruins under very heavy fire. Casualties mounted and replacements were hard to come by. Hitler forbade any withdrawal, turning the battle into a grinding war of attrition. By November 1942, the Germans controlled most of the city, but had failed to eliminate the Soviet resistance along the Volga. Meanwhile, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, prepared a massive counter-offensive. Rather than strike directly at Stalingrad, the soldiers targeted the weaker Axis forces, the Romanian, Hungarian and Italian armies, guarding the flanks of the German Sixth Army. On the 19th of November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Over 1 million troops, supported by tanks and artillery, smashed through the Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, north and south of Stalingrad. Within days, Soviet forces encircled the Sixth Army and parts of the 4th Panzer Army in a huge pocket around the city. The Germans were trapped. Estimates suggest that around 290,000 Axis soldiers, mostly German but also some Romanians and others, were caught in the encirclement. The German High Command debated their options. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein urged a breakout, but Adolf Hitler refused to allow Paulus to abandon Stalingrad. Instead, Hitler and head of the Luftwaffe Hermann Göring promised that the Sixth Army would be supplied by air. The Luftwaffe, however, could not meet the necessary 700 tons of supplies per day. At best, it managed around 100 to 150 tons a day. Soldiers quickly faced shortages of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and also winter clothing. Hunger, frostbite and disease then took a terrible toll. In December 1942, Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm, an attempt to relieve the encircled army. His forces advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket, but they were halted by fierce Soviet resistance. Paulus, who was forbidden to attempt a breakout, could not link up. The relief effort failed. By January 1943, the situation inside Stalingrad was catastrophic. Soldiers ate horses, dogs, and even boiled leather to survive. Casualties mounted daily, and morale completely collapsed. On the 10th of January 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, a massive offensive to destroy the pocket. Overwhelming artillery barrages and infantry assaults gradually compressed the Germans into the ruins of the city. On the 31st of January, Paulus surrendered the southern part of the pocket. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal the previous day, hinting that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered, implying that he should probably take his own life. But Paulus refused, stating he would not shoot himself for this Bohemian corporal, as in Hitler. On the 2nd of February 1943, the last German units in the northern pocket surrendered. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. The scale of the losses was staggering. The German Sixth Army, for example, they lost around 91,000 who became prisoners, including 22 generals. They were all marched into captivity. Fewer than 6,000 ever returned after years inside Soviet camps. Total German casualties today are estimated at around 300,000 dead, wounded or captured. Now, the Soviet losses were incredible. Estimates vary, but around 1.1 to 1.2 million Soviet soldiers and civilians were either killed, wounded or captured. But there is another cost: civilians. Hundreds of thousands perished during the bombing, fighting and from starvation. The city of Stalingrad itself was devastated. Of 90,000 buildings, only a few dozen remained intact. But the Battle of Stalingrad marked a major turning point in World War II. Firstly, it was a strategic shift. The German offensive in the east was permanently halted. The Soviets seized the initiative and began a series of offensives that would carry them westwards. Also, it was a psychological blow. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. It was the first major defeat that Germany could not conceal and hide. There was also a political impact though. The Axis allies, Italy, Hungary and Romania, lost faith in the German leadership after their troops suffered catastrophic losses. But there was a massive impact on Soviet morale. Victory boosted Soviet confidence and prestige. Stalin emerged stronger, both domestically and internationally. The Battle of Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance and sacrifice. In the Soviet Union, it was celebrated as the greatest victory of the Great Patriotic War. In Germany, it marked the beginning of decline. Post-war memorials, especially the colossal statue, the Motherland Calls on Mamier of Kurgan, commemorate the battle's significance. Historians continue to study it as an example of urban warfare, leadership and the consequences of strategic overreach. The Battle of Stalingrad was not short in any sense. It lasted months, involved millions of men, and consumed vast amounts of resources. Yet its outcome was pretty decisive. What began as Hitler's bid to seize the oil of the Caucasus and the prestige of Stalin's city ended with the destruction of an entire German army. The suffering endured by soldiers and civilians alike was almost unimaginable. But from that suffering came a shift in the course of the Second World War. After Stalingrad, the Red Army moved from defence to offence, and their march towards Berlin well and truly began. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this interesting. To support our channel, please click subscribe.